So in our last episode, we closed with David and the 400 at the caves of Adullam. Now, the outlaw years had begun. That's what we talked about there. This is 1 Samuel chapter 22, verses 1 to 2. David left Gath and escaped to the cave of Adullam. When his brothers and his father's household heard about it, they went down to him there. And all those who were in distress or in debt or discontented gathered around him, and he became their commander. About 400 men were with him. I mentioned how this 400 would be the beginning of the army of David. This was it was the seed. It was the seed of the most famous army in the Bible. This is a really important time period in the story of David. The formation of his character, the sealing, the maturation of who he was. It was born out right here. Although it's not specified in the Bible, scholars believe the entire period here is one of about 6 to 8 years. 4 years on the run from Saul in the wilderness when he holed up at the cave of Adullam, and then another 2 to 4 years in Ziklag. And we'll get to that part of the story here in a bit. The first thing we notice for this part of the story in chapter 23 of 1 Samuel, we see a shift in David's operations, the way he worked. At the caves of Adullam, he's recovering from the humiliation in Gath, right? There before King Achish of the Philistines. He's recovering from the catastrophic fallout of his visit to Ahimelech and the priests in Nob. We talked about both of those stories in the last episode, but remember, David is now in the frontier region. It's just on the outskirts of the territory that Saul had securely put under his control in the lands where the Philistines would often make raids there in this frontier region. So David and his 400 began to build a name for themselves as they started to rescue and protect the people, the Israelites, most of them Israelites, living in these frontier lands. They were protecting them mostly from the Philistines themselves, these raids that the Philistines would go under because they were just on the outskirts of what Saul had securely under his control. Now, it's easy to read the story and assume that all that occurs here was just a natural outworking of David's presence there in Adullam. It wasn't, though. He's still trying to figure it all out. He doesn't want to operate on his own free will, his own intuition and rational instincts anymore. He's learned his lesson. And we know this. We know that something's changed in him in the way he sees the world and the way he decides he's going to operate in life. We know this because one of the first stories of this period in chapter 23 involves the settlement of Keilah. Now, Keilah was more than a settlement, really. It was a fortified city, but it was alone out there in the frontier region. And the Philistines would routinely terrorize Keilah. And David and his men heard about that. And David had this idea, let's go protect them. Why not? You know, he had all these men gathering to him. He was the one-time champion of Israel, after all. Why shouldn't he go to Keilah and protect them? What's to stop him from being a protector in the frontier region? But that rationale, that way of thinking, that had gotten him into trouble before. So David tries a new tactic at this point. 1 Samuel 23, verses 1 to 2, it says, when David was told, look, the Philistines are fighting against Keilah and are looting the threshing floors, he inquired of the Lord, saying, shall I go and attack these Philistines? The Lord answered him, go, attack the Philistines, and save Keilah. Now, today, churches and ministers do teachings on David's habit of inquiring of the Lord. But at the time, right here at this passage, this is a new thing. David's finding a new way to live, a new way to lead, a new way to operate his life. And that new way, that new mode of operation would be the foundation of his kingdom. The 400 with him, they didn't see themselves as the army of David yet. They're just the downtrodden of the land, huddled with David in the caves. They balk, in fact, at this very idea of going down and saving Keilah. They balk. So when they balk, David says, well, am I sure? So he goes back to God again. He inquires, and again, God gives him the green light. Now, that's a pretty big difference. That mode of operation is a pretty big difference, a pretty big shift from the impulsiveness we saw with someone like Saul in his early years. But this is the foundation of David. And it's the foundation of the kingdom of God that's going to be built through this new man and Israel. So David and his 400, they head out to Keilah and they rout the Philistines, but Saul hears about it. And he's convinced that David has trapped himself at Keilah. So he sends his own army of 600 out to trap the outlaws. This is verses 7 to 8 of that chapter. Saul was told that David had gone to Keilah, and he said, God has delivered him into my hands, for David has imprisoned himself by entering a town with gates and bars. And Saul called up all his forces for battle to go down to Keilah to besiege David and his men. Now, Abiathar, the last surviving priest who escaped that massacre at Nob that we looked at in the last episode, he's fled and he's taken shelter with David. He begins to teach David how to inquire of God. So David, with Abiathar, he asks God if the people of Keilah, knowing this trap is coming from Saul, he says, will the people of Keilah, will they turn me over to Saul? He doesn't assume. David doesn't. He doesn't rely on his instincts. David's relying on the voice of God now. He's learning to rely on the voice of God now. What's God saying? That's what I want to follow. And God tells him, yes, they're going to betray you. Verses 13 to 14. So David and his men, about 600 in number now, notice that it's grown, they left Keilah and kept moving from place to place. When Saul was told that David had escaped from Keilah, he didn't go there. David stayed in the wilderness strongholds in the hills of the desert of Ziph. Day after day, Saul searched for him, but God did not give David into his hand. So our hero is finding his footing now. He's figuring out how he's supposed to operate. He's finding the design of God for his life. And it all looks easy from the vantage point thousands of years removed from the situation. But this is what the seed planting years, the seed planting season of life, this is what they look like. For every young man or woman out there listening, the hard times, those early years of marriage, of adulthood, those are the seed planting seasons. That's when you find out who you really are, how you're going to operate in the world that you live in. Will you go on instinct? Will you go on your free will? Will you determine what you're going to do based on what looks best, most in your interest? Or will you determine to seek out and inquire of God? Follow his word by faith. Even if it's risky, even if it's dangerous, this is the heart that God loves. And this is the design of God for a life that he likes to bless over the course of time. Get the seeds right. The fruit in future seasons, it'll be right also. Make the hard decisions now or make harder decisions later. That's what it comes down to. So for 4 years, Saul pursues David through these frontier lands. Time after time, he almost catches him. But David continues to move a step beyond his pursuer. Now, there's another part of this story, though, that we've got to touch on. Not only does David keep escaping the hands of Saul during this time period, but two times, he's got the opportunity to kill Saul, to end all the running, to take matters into his own hands, and David refrains. He doesn't do it. And I want to look at both of these events, both of these incidents. I want to clear up some of what I think are misperceptions about what takes place here. And the first occasion is in 1 Samuel chapter 24. I'm just going to read it here. It says, after Saul returned from pursuing the Philistines, he was told, David is in the desert of En-Gedi. So Saul took 3,000 able young men from all of Israel and set out to look for David and his men near the crags of the wild goats. He came to the sheep pens along the way. There was a cave there, and Saul went in to relieve himself. David and his men were far back in the cave. And the men said, this is the day our Lord spoke of when he said to you, I will give your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish. Then David crept up unnoticed and cut off a corner of Saul's robe. Afterward, this is verse 5, afterward David was conscience-stricken for having cut off a corner of his king's robe, or of his robe. He said to his men, the Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, or lay my hand on him, for he is the anointed of the Lord. With these words, David sharply rebuked his men and did not allow them to attack Saul. And Saul left the cave and went his way. So on this first occasion, Saul actually goes off by himself to use the bathroom in the cave that David and some of his men are hiding out in. And I think if it were you or me, I know if it was me, we would look at this situation and see that God had obviously just delivered our enemy into our hands. Kill him in the running, in the nonsense. But David doesn't. And we're going to come back to this in a minute. I want to look at the second occasion first. It's in chapter 26. Saul and his army of 3,000, once again, they're chasing David and his men. They make camp for the evening, and Saul sleeps at the center of the camp, all right? So his generals are sleeping all around him, safest place in the camp, right there. And despite that safety, that security, that really the security plan to keep Saul safe, David and his men, they realize they have the ability to walk right up to Saul, walk right through the camp, and do what they like. This is verses 6 to 12 of 1 Samuel chapter 26. It says, David then asked Ahimelech the Hittite and Abishai, son of Zeruiah, Joab's brother, who will go down into the camp with me to Saul? I'll go with you, said Abishai. So David and Abishai went to the army by night, and there was Saul lying inside the camp with his spear stuck in the ground near his head. Abner and the soldiers were lying around him. Abishai said to David, today God has delivered your enemy into your hands. Now let me pin him to the ground with one thrust of the spear. I won't strike him twice. But David said to Abishai, don't destroy him. Who can lay a hand on the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? As surely as the Lord lives, he said, the Lord himself will strike him, or his time will come and he will die, or he will go into battle and perish. But the Lord forbid that I should lay a hand on the Lord's anointed. Now get the spear and water jug that are near his head, and let's go. So David took the spear and the water jug near Saul's head, and they left. No one saw or knew about it, nor did anyone wake up. They were all sleeping because the Lord had put them into a deep sleep. So David and Abishai, they head back to the hilltop from where they were hiding, and they begin, once they get there, they begin hollering until Saul and his men wake up. And they start yelling out taunts to Abner. That's Saul's lead general. Why have you not protected the king, Abner? Well, Abner doesn't know what's going on. He doesn't know what they're talking about. This is verse 13 to 20. Then David crossed over to the other side and stood on top of the hill some distance away. There was a wide space between them. He called out to the army and to Abner, son of Ner, aren't you going to answer me, Abner? Abner replied, who are you who calls to the king? David said, you're a man, aren't you? And who is like you in Israel? Why didn't you guard your lord the king? Someone came to destroy your lord the king. What you have done is not good. As surely as the Lord lives, you and your men must die because you did not guard your master, the Lord's anointed. Look around you. Where are the king's spear and water jug that were near his head? Saul recognized David's voice and said, is that your voice, David, my son? David replied, yes, it is, my lord the king. And he added, why is my lord pursuing his servant? What have I done? And what wrong am I guilty of? Now let my lord the king listen to his servant's word. If the Lord has incited you against me, then may he accept as an offering. If, however, people have done it, may they be cursed before the Lord. They have driven me today from my share in the Lord's inheritance and have said, go serve other gods. Now do not let my blood fall to the ground far from the presence of the Lord. The king of Israel has come out to look for a flea as one hunts a partridge in the mountains. Then Saul said, I have sinned. Come back, David, my son. Because you considered my life precious today, I will not try to harm you. Again, surely I have acted like a fool and have been terribly wrong. So for the second time, right there, the second time in 2 chapters, David spares Saul's life. The circumstances, the situation, they all suggest that God had delivered Saul right into David's hands. So the question is, why didn't he do it? In the second example, the second incident, it even says that God caused a deep sleep to fall on Saul's army and the king himself. So looking purely at circumstances, surely this should have been proof that God was in this. He was giving Saul over to David. And the question, why didn't David kill Saul? Notice the one thing we never see David do in either of these passages. He doesn't inquire of God. God didn't tell him to spare Saul, but God didn't tell him to kill Saul either. Something else is driving our hero here. Something else is working within him here. So what is it? Now, over 20 years ago, there was a book that I read. I don't remember when it came out. I'm not going to give the name of the book, but it's pretty popular. And if you've read it, you'll recognize it as I'm talking about it. But I read this book that talked about how and why David spared Saul because of the mantle of authority that was on the king. God put the mantle of authority on Saul. And so it was up to God to remove it. Right? Not David. It wasn't up to David. It was up to God. So that's why you have the famous line by David, who can lay a hand on the Lord's anointed and be guiltless, right? As surely as the Lord lives, he said, the Lord himself will strike him, or his time will come and he will die, or he will go into a battle and perish. But the Lord forbid that I should lay a hand on the Lord's anointed. Or the King James Version, which is more popular as far as this passage goes, says, touch not the Lord's anointed. Now, I can go along with that idea to a point. That's why David didn't lay a hand on Saul. That's why David didn't kill Saul. I can go with that so far. Why didn't David inquire of God, though? Where did he get this idea? It still doesn't tell me why, I guess is the problem. Where did he get this idea that it wasn't up to him to kill Saul, and that was God's business, not his? Here's the problem I have with that popular viewpoint. It rests on the assumption of God's sovereignty, which is a good thing. But this interpretation of God's sovereignty, the one in this popular perspective of why David didn't lay his hand on the anointed, this idea of God's sovereignty means that if God is sovereign, then man should be complacent, even apathetic. Don't do anything. Let God work it out. That's not an actual biblical perspective. There are examples later in the story of David where his own children, they do some pretty wicked stuff. And in those examples, David has the right, he's got the obligation, even the duty, to do something about what these kids are doing, what grown kids are doing, as both their father and the king of Israel at that point. But David doesn't do it. And when he fails to act in these situations, it's a bad move on his part. It's complacent. It's apathy. It's a problem. So I can't read these passages about David sparing Saul and say, yeah, let's just let God work it out. But then read those passages about his children and say, well, the king has a job to do. That's not a balanced perspective here. God isn't legislating apathy and complacency among his people by highlighting these stories in David's life. There's something else going on. I think there's something else to see here. And this is my theory. This is my theory about why David spared Saul and why God honored this, because God does honor what David does here. Just my theory here. Take it for what you will. When we read scripture from Genesis to Revelation, one of the common themes we find over and over again is that God likes people who live by a code. You got Abraham, Noah, Job, even David here. Lots of people in scripture, they had a code they lived by. Sometimes we'll see they were blameless and upright, unlike anyone else in their generation, things like that, right? It was an internal code that they lived by, an internal ethic that they held faithful to, and God liked it. It got his attention. We see it over and over again. They held faithful to their code, even when it caused them harm or disadvantage. Now, that's ultimately what the technology of faith is all about. It's living by a standard that can be sensed internally, but not seen externally. Like the book of Hebrews says, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things unseen. When men and women in Scripture found that internal code and lived by it, God likes it. It wasn't always the same code. That wasn't necessarily the point. They found the personal conviction for their lives. If it was just a set of rules, then anybody could find it and follow it. The point was that they found an internal code and they lived by it. David found his code right here in these years on the run, in the outlaw years, in these incidents with Saul. His internal ethic, that's what the outlaw years for our hero are really all about. His ethics are being built during this time period. The internal code of his heart is being established as lifestyle realities for the future king. When he catches Saul unaware in the cave, in that first example, he cuts off a piece of the king's robe. And the scripture says, afterward, David was conscience-stricken for having cut off a corner of his robe. Something pierced his conscience, and he knew he had done wrong. He had violated something unseen, something unwritten. Everything in the circumstances justified what he did, even more, right? God called David to be king. He rejected Saul. Saul was an unjust tyrant. Saul was the murderer. David had the right. These were the things that the situation told him. But his conscience told him differently. The code said something else, and he followed the code. On our second occasion, Abishai says to David, "Clearly the Lord has delivered your enemy into our hands." We let him get away once, not a second time. Come on, David, God's making his intent clear here. And David obviously considers it. That's why they go into the camp. It all looks right. But again, something holds him back. Don't destroy him, David says. Who can lay a hand on the Lord's anointed and be guilty or be guiltless? Now, why would David be guilty? It wasn't because God said not to do it. It was because the code that was written on David's heart held him back. He couldn't violate that internal code, that internal conviction. Now, this is one of the major pieces of the story of David, the man after God's own heart. His ethics are being formed here. It's an ethic that God honored. But I don't think the focus should be on the rule. That's what that book that I talked about earlier, that I read 20-something years ago, that's what it did, all right? And my interpretation of it, I don't think that's a correct view of what's unfolding here. See, we take passages like this and we turn them into rules. Don't speak against authority. Do this, don't do that. And I think that's missing the point. The real point is finding the code written in our own hearts. What's right? What's wrong? That's our ethics. That's what we abide by. It's about following the invisible convictions written by God into our own hearts. That gets his attention. God likes that. I think that's why these stories are featured in the life of David. I think that's what God wants us to see. Yeah, there's basic morality of right and wrong, but there's also specific prescriptions of boundaries for our life. You could go here by your own will, but there's something in your heart that says, don't go there, don't do that, don't go that far. Years later, David would pen one of my favorite psalms. It's Psalm 15. And he asked the question in this psalm about who can dwell in the presence of God. And it's an important question. And it's one that's answered by none other than our hero, as he, the very man who is after God's own heart, defined how we become the people who dwell in the house of God. Now, listen to this. Listen to this psalm as I read it, but hear it from the standpoint of these directions that he gives in this psalm. These directions are about following the code, the personal ethic written on David's heart. He found the code for his life and he lived it. We have to find the code for our lives and we have to live it. That's what's pleasing to God. Psalm 15, this is the New Living Translation. It says, "Who may worship in your sanctuary, Lord? Who may enter your presence on your holy hill? Those who lead blameless lives and do what is right, speaking the truth from sincere hearts. Those who refuse to gossip or harm their neighbors or speak evil of their friends. Those who despise flagrant sinners and honor the faithful followers of the Lord and keep their promises even when it hurts. Those who lend money without charging interest and who cannot be bribed to lie about the innocents. Such people will stand firm forever." Hey folks, I hope you're enjoying this podcast episode and our look at the life of David, the Days of David podcast series. As always, if you'd like to support the podcast, you can become a Patreon supporter. Just go to patreon.com/JBShreve for as little as $1 a month. You can help support the podcast. Plus, you'll get access to our archived episodes from both jbshreve.com and theendofhistory.net. So that's archived episodes from past podcast devotionals that we've done, podcast biblical study series that we've done, also historical series on the Middle East, India, all kinds of backgrounders if you want to learn more about what's going on in the world today. Both of those are available to our Patreon supporters at, again, I'm going to say it again, patreon.com/JBShreve. If you forget the link somehow, if you forget that link, patreon.com/JBShreve, you can head to jbshreve.com and click on the Patreon icon at the right side of the page, and it'll take you right there. Outside of that, let's go ahead and jump back to today's podcast episode from our Days of David podcast series. So 2 things I want to touch on in this episode before we leave this part of the story of David, the outlaw years. I want to look at the men and women who joined David during these years, look a little deeper into them. So starting in 2 Samuel 28 and then again in 1 Chronicles 11. we learn about this elite group of fighters within David's army that began forming while he was there at the stronghold at the cave of Adullam. All right. So these were known as David's mighty men. These guys are the stuff that legends are made of. And that's exactly what they were during these times. When these words were written, these were the legends of David's kingdom. They've been the legends ever since. These are the best of the best. One modern translation describes them as David's special forces rather than David's mighty men. Within each of their individual stories is at least one heroic tale, a great feat of battle, of might that set them apart from the rest of the army, from the rest of the kingdom, and included them in the ranks of this elite band of David's closest, his most heralded fighters. You can't help, when you're reading about the mighty men, you can't help but think of the Knights of the Round Table with King Arthur, or I think of like the kinsmen who banded with William Wallace and Braveheart. When you read about the mighty men of David, these are the images that come to my mind. One of these guys, Jashabim, he killed over 800 men in a single battle. He was proficient with a spear, he handled the spear kind of like John Wick handles a Glock, right? So another guy, Eleazar, he stood alone with David after the rest of the Israelite army fled the battlefield. They fought off the Philistines with such ferocity that Eleazar's grip, his forearm, locked, and he couldn't let go of the sword for some time after the fighting was done. We touched on this guy, Abishai, earlier. He was actually one of David's cousins, right? The brother of Joab, who would end up being the commander of David's army. Joab did. Well, Abishai, he's the guy who approached King Saul while he slept in the middle of Saul's camp, along with David, tried to convince David to kill Saul. Remember, when he approached Saul's sleeping body, Abishai urged David, let me thrust him with a spear through Saul. Abishai guarantees he wouldn't need to take 2 blows. He could finish the job with 1 blow. He too is proficient with a spear. According to these descriptions of the mighty men of David in these passages in 2 Samuel and 1 Chronicles, on one occasion, Abishai, all by himself, took out 300 Philistines with his spear. On another occasion, recorded in 2 Samuel 21, Abishai killed one of the giant sons of none other than Goliath. Apparently, this occurred when Abishai was an older man, and he nearly died in that fight with the giant. So after killing the giant, David forces Abishai into retirement because, according to the passage in 2 Samuel 21, David and the army feared Abishai would go out to fight one day and not return from battle, thus quenching the lamp of Israel, is what David said. So Abishai was a living legend, and David and the people, they couldn't bear the thought of the living legend dying in battle. As you read through the legends and the tales of the mighty men, you see the brotherhood, the warrior culture among these elite fighters closest to David. It wasn't all run and hide in the wilderness years. These guys were bonding together under that code of David that we talked about. They were bonding together as fighters, as brothers in arms, and daring each other, pushing each other onward like a group like this would naturally do. This guy, Benaiah, he's another one of the mighty men. One day he climbed into a pit with a lion and killed it. On another day, he faced off with this powerful Egyptian warrior, nameless warrior, in hand-to-hand combat and fought him to death. You can imagine the troops in that scene gathered around for the spectacle, cheering the fight on. Scholars believe that these tales of the mighty men of David, they were probably documented in another book, a book not included in the Bible, but something passed around Israel during this era, and that helped the legends of the mighty men grow. And then a summary of that book was included in these passages that I'm drawing from today in this episode in 2 Samuel and in 1 Chronicles. The mighty men of David, they were separated into elite troops of 30 fighters, some of them captains, some of them even included within a best of the best crew with only 3 people. And then there were other fighters, other men of David's army. They weren't even included among the mighty men, but they still did heroic deeds and fought heroic battles. There's a guy, Elhanan. He killed the brother of Goliath, presumably another giant. Then there's this story of none other than one of David's nephews who faced off and killed another son of Goliath. This is a creepy giant figure, nameless, but he had 6 fingers and 6 toes on each hand and foot, so 24 altogether, 24 digits altogether. And this nephew of David's, he killed the son of Goliath, this son of Goliath, he's not even included among the mighty men. Here's what strikes me about David and his mighty men, though. Some of these guys matched David's most famous acts of heroism and valor. They killed giants, the very brothers of Goliath himself. Some of them even surpassed David with what he did as a warrior, right? And hand-to-hand or one-on-one fight, a guy like Abishai or Benaiah or any number of the mighty men, they probably could have taken David. They probably could have beat him. They're drawing to the future king of Israel. If that's the case, that meant they're drawing to the future king of Israel. It wasn't based on his power alone. His qualification in their eyes wasn't his prowess as a warrior. They were bonded with him at the heart level. I've shared this story with young guys before through the years when talking about David's mighty men. Being great is not about being the best. That's not what we're called to be. It's not about being the strongest. It's not about, being mighty. It's really about finding where you belong, who you belong to. Now, that's not a familiar American or Western concept. We all want to be independent. We want to be self-made. But the heroes of David's army, these legends, the mighty men, their identity was rooted to knowing who they belonged to and devoting their life to that cause. Yeah, they belonged to God, but they also knew who they were supposed to follow on earth. And that's a key definition of life that we each have to find. Who has God called us to follow? None of us are supposed to be walking alone. We can be superstars like the mighty men, but our life doesn't have to have meaning. It won't have meaning unless we find our fit in God's plan. And that fit means finding who we belong to, who our company is. And the mighty men did that. There's a famous story of the mighty men that's captured in 2 Samuel chapter 21. Seems like a simple story when compared to the other heroic acts that describe these guys in this same chapter, but we got to look deeper. The story is telling about the heart of these guys, and it's also telling about the heart of David. This is in chapter 23 of 2 Samuel, verses 14 and 17. It said, David was then in the stronghold, and the garrison of the Philistines was then in Bethlehem. And David said with longing, "Oh, that someone would give me a drink of water from the well of Bethlehem, which is by the gate." So the three mighty men broke through the camp of the Philistines, drew water from the well of Bethlehem that was by the gate, and took it and brought it to David. Nevertheless, he would not drink it, but poured it out before the Lord. And he said, "Far be it from me, O Lord, that I should do this. Is this not the blood of the men who went in jeopardy of their lives?" Therefore, he would not drink it. So the scene's pretty simple. David's at the cave of Adullam, the stronghold, and he's homesick. He misses the taste of water from the well at his hometown. The problem is the Philistines have set up a garrison there, and they're guarding Bethlehem. So these members of the ranks of the mighty men, they hear about David's homesickness, and they sneak into Bethlehem. On an unauthorized mission, they sneak into Bethlehem and secure a container of water, then bring it back to David. Well, he refuses to drink it. Instead, he pours it out on the ground like an offering or like a waste, depending on your perspective. We could see these actions and his responses from the wrong position. David didn't appreciate their sacrifice, or they esteemed David too highly. But that's not really what's going on here. When we see the heart of these men, highly devoted to their leader, they knew who they belonged to. But David also knew who he belonged to. He understood his charge, his influence over these men. He could have reveled in this act of daring and sacrifice that they made for him. He could have let them build a cult of personality with him at the center. But he knew that such sacrifice was worthy only of God, and he refused to drink it. The mighty men gave their hearts to David, and David guided those hearts to God. Now, those are powerful lessons for the construct of life. This is how the rightly designed life and community should live. Powerful lessons in these pages of the epic of the days of David. But if the mighty men give us a picture of honor and divine design for how life is to be lived before God, David's response and actions towards women is an altogether different story. Now, I've promised in earlier episodes we would get to this, and here we go. All right. Remember the context. David and his men, they're in the outlaw years. The army is forming, the seeds of the army of the Lord, their ethics, their values, their legendary heroics. All of that is being sown right now in this period for reaping later on. But there's some other stuff being sown here too. As David and his men scrambled about the frontier lands, evading Saul, pushing back on the Philistines, they defended several of the large farms in the area. Well, one such farm, that which belonged to this guy named Nabal was a rich man, notorious for his harshness as well as for his beautiful wife, Abigail. Well, for some time, David's men chased away the Philistines and other ne'er-do-wellers from the lands of Nabal whenever they would come around. And it was their contribution to the people who lived in these lands, these frontier lands there in Judah. At one point, David sent some of his men to the house of Nabal, and he instructs the men, hey, remind him who we are, what we've done for him, ask if he would have some supplies, if we could have some supplies from Nabal. Well, Nabal's response to these representatives of David is less than gracious. It's recorded in 1 Samuel 25, verses 10 to 11. Who is this fellow David? Nabal sneered to the young men. Who does this son of Jesse think he is? There are lots of servants these days who run away from their masters. Should I take my bread and my water and my meat that I've slaughtered from my shearers and give it to a band of outlaws who come from who knows where? Well, that response, David is incensed. How dare Nabal treat us with such contempt and rudeness? He orders the men to arm themselves, and he's all set to lead a raiding party onto the house of Nabal itself. As they begin their trek to Nabal's headquarters, his home, one of the servants tells Abigail, Nabal's wife, they tell her what's transpired. And the Bible goes out of its way to describe Abigail as a wise and insightful woman. It doesn't take her long to figure out how all of this is going to end. Verses 18 to 25, Abigail wasted no time. She quickly gathered 200 loaves of bread, 2 wineskins full of wine, 5 sheep that had been slaughtered, nearly a bushel of roasted grain, 100 clusters of raisins, 200 fig cakes. She packed them on donkeys and said to her servants, "Go on ahead, I will follow you shortly." But she didn't tell her husband Nabal what she was doing. As she was riding her donkey into a mountain ravine, she saw David and his men coming toward her. David had just been saying a lot of good it did to help this fellow. We protected his flocks in the wilderness, and nothing he owned was lost or stolen. But he's repaid me evil for good. May God strike me and kill me if even one man of his household is still alive tomorrow morning. When Abigail saw David, she quickly got off her donkey and bowed low before him. She fell at his feet and said, "I accept all blame in this matter, my lord. Please listen to what I have to say. I know Nabal is a wicked and ill-tempered man. Please don't pay attention to him. He's a fool, just as his name suggests, but I never saw the young men you sent." Abigail literally saves the day right here. Her intercession, her kind words, they do so much as to quench David's wrath, and he turns back from his plan to raid and kill Nabal and his household. Abigail departs from the meeting and returns home to find her husband drunk, and he's throwing a party. Picking up at verse 36 in 1 Samuel 25. When Abigail arrived home, she found that Nabal was throwing a big party and was celebrating like a king. He was very drunk, so she didn't tell him anything about her meeting with David until dawn the next day. In the morning, when Nabal was sober, his wife told him what had happened. As a result, he had a stroke, and he lay paralyzed on his bed like a stone. About 10 days later, the Lord struck him, and he died. Well, newly widowed signaled ready to mingle as far as David was concerned. And in the very next set of verses, we read that he sent messengers to Abigail, asking her to become his wife. And so begins David's second marriage to his second wife. Remember, his first marriage was to Michal. But this isn't going to be his last. And tracking the children of David in 1 Chronicles 3, we learn that he also married Ahinoam, Maachan, Haggith, Abital, Eglah, and of course, there's Bathsheba out there in the future story. Not all of those marriages are born out of love. Some were marriages to form political alliances with the women's fathers who were kings of other lands, right? So a lot of marrying going on here with David. Now, we could discount all of this polygamy as a custom of the times. Kings married multiple wives all the time. No big deal, right? But the thing is, there was specific instruction about this issue in the Bible. Deuteronomy 17:17, the king must not take many wives for himself because they will turn his heart away from the Lord. Pretty simple. We see the reality of this verse play out with David's son, Solomon. When he comes to the throne, he would end up marrying 700 wives and grew totally distracted from the things of God. That's what Solomon does. But for David, it all played out a little differently. Remember, this is the seed planting season of his life. And although 1st and 2nd Samuel doesn't get explicit in stating it was wrong for David to marry so many wives, the fruit that these decisions would produce for him would be quite the headache. All of his wives, except Michal, they bore him a son, and these sons would be the source of all kinds of grief. There would be coup attempts, rivalries, murders, rapes in the future from these sons. And these are the consequences for these decisions by David here in this season. And the question that comes to my mind when I'm reading these stories, when I'm reading about all these wives, why was David constantly drawn toward women like this? It wasn't just marriages. There's the adultery, of course. And later we're going to see he's got an issue with concubines as well. And when I read the story of David, this issue with women, his constant need, unending need for female affection that was never satisfied, it does signal an issue, a probable issue of the heart, a fracture, a place that needed healing that was never properly addressed within David. Some counselors today might refer to this as a soul wound, some kind of trauma inflicted on him when he was young. It left a gap in his development, in his emotional, in his psychological development. It left him looking for some way to fill the gap, ease the pain. And we're never told what the trauma was, although, I hinted in an earlier episode in this series what I think it was. But I think you can draw a straight line from the pain he experienced in his younger years to the terrible sin he ends up committing with Bathsheba in later years. The many wives, the affairs, the concubines, all of those things in between, those are warning signs. You're getting off track, David. Things aren't right. Most of us carry these kinds of scars on our own heart. They vary in cause, they vary in shape and symptoms, but there they are, right? The scars, the wounds of life, those are meant to turn us toward God. We're supposed to run to him with our wounds, seek healing from his presence, his touch. That's what David should have done. In many areas of life, that's what he did. But this one, for some reason, there was an exception. David, the great warrior, walked through all these years with a heart that was vulnerable, was compromised. And the evidence keeps popping up again and again in our story. And it'll culminate with Bathsheba. And there are even after effects of that terrible fall from grace that we'll look at in future episodes. But that's all later on. For now, we find that after 4 years, David's fed up with running from Saul. After sparing Saul's life for that second time, he's had enough. 1 Samuel 27 verses 1-4. But David kept thinking to himself, someday Saul is going to get me. The best I can do is escape to the Philistines. Then Saul will stop hunting for me in Israelite territory, and I'll finally be safe. So David took his 600 men and went over and joined Achish, son of Maoch, the king of Gath. David and his men and their families settled there with Achish at Gath. David brought 2 of his wives along with him, Ahinoam from Jezreel and Abigail, Nabal's widow from Carmel. Word soon reached Saul that David had fled to Gath, so he stopped hunting for him. And the story of Saul's pursuit of David concludes right there. For the next year and a half, maybe 2 years of David's life, he lives in the wilderness of Ziklag. At the time, this was land under Philistine control, and the Philistine king Achish realized he had a strategic opportunity here. Rather than fighting the armies of David on one front and the armies of Saul on another front, he could neutralize David and fight Saul's army alone. Achish basically gifted Ziklag to David at this point in exchange for a friendship with David. And that's where our hero and his growing army resides for the duration of 1 Samuel. What Achish didn't know was that David was secretly going out on raids and eliminating the enemies of Israel from his safe zone there in Ziklag. 2 Samuel chapter 27, starting at verse 8, says, David and his men spent their time raiding the Geshurites, the Girzites, and the Amalekites, people who had lived near Shur, toward the land of Egypt since ancient times. David did not leave one person alive in the villages he attacked. He took the sheep, goats, cattle, donkey, camels, and clothing before returning home to see King Achish. Where did you make your raid today? Achish would ask, and David would reply, against the south of Judah. He's saying he's attacking his own kinsmen, basically. The Jerahmeelites, the Kenites of Judah. No one was left alive to come to Gath and tell where he had really been. This happened again and again while he was living among the Philistines. Achish believed David and thought to himself, by now the people of Israel must hate him bitterly. Now he will have to stay here and serve me forever. And this is where we pause in our story. This is where we conclude this week's episode. When we come back next week, we're going to look at the end of the house of Saul with a special episode entitled The Mighty Have Fallen. Next week will also mark the end of our story that takes place in the book of 1 Samuel, and we're going to move over to 2 Samuel in the next episode. That's next week as we continue this podcast series, The Days of David.